Hello, everyone. I'm Evelyn Sue, Director of Programs at the Poynter Institute, and on behalf of Maynard, the Oakland Tribune, and the California Endowment, welcome to this webinar on violence and trauma. Our moderator is Aly Colon, who is a newsroom trainer who has served on the faculty of the Poynter Institute. Aly, welcome, and I'm going to turn the program over to you to introduce our guests and get our conversation started.
Today we have a real special guest, Scott Johnson, who is the Oakland Tribune's Violence Reporting Fellow, and he's an investigative position that's funded by the California Endowment. And he's been with the Tribune for a year. He's also reported from other places and from overseas as well, and has had a special project in which he's reporting about violence and trauma in Oakland. So I want you all to know that this will be a conversation that you'll be able to listen to, and I hope you will be able to learn from Scott some of the tips and techniques that were important to him as he covered this topic. All right, well, Scott, welcome. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me, Aly, and thanks to the Tribune and the Poynter Institute for hosting this, and also to all of the guests who have come here to participate. Thank you.
Good. We're going to go, Scott, and sort of review three key themes that you've identified for us that are important. And I'm going to just repeat them here now, but then we'll go back to the first one. And the three key themes that we've got have to do with the young people who live in a precarious circumstance, need to the presence of a caring adult. The other part of it has to do with that toxic neighborhoods become toxic and traumatic for the people living in them. And finally, the third will be that trauma adversely affects brains, but healing helps reverse the damage. So let's go back to the first one about young people in precarious circumstances and the need for caring adult. What's that all about, Scott?
Well, this basically, this idea originated, came about during a discussion that I was having when I first started this work here in Oakland with a researcher in Philadelphia named John Rich, who works at the Drexel School of Public Health. Very fascinating guy. He's written a book. I encourage all of you to read about him or read things that he's written if you can. You'll learn a lot. And basically, one of the first things that he said to me was that in the years that he'd been working with kids who were in trouble in Philadelphia, he found that the single most important factor in determining their outcome, what happened to them, how well they did or how poorly they did, whether they lived or died, whether they went to jail or not. The single most important factor was the presence of a caring adult. So did they have an adult in their life? Didn't have to be a parent. It could be a mentor, a teacher, a grandparent, somebody in their life who took an interest in them and promoted their well-being.
And so what would you say are the things that those type of individuals can bring, in addition to what you just mentioned about caring about the well-being of them, that are important in helping people in those precarious positions that maybe we don't tend to think about?
Well, I'm not sure that it's stuff that we don't think about. I think it is kind of the stuff that we do think about. It's structure. It's a sense of one's moral place in the world. It's a sense of responsibility. It's socialization. It's providing all those cues, body cues, social cues, linguistic cues, facial clues that help kids transition into teens and teens transition into young adults. And the reason I mention that is because research has shown that even though the legal age of adulthood in this country is 18, our brains are developing and continue to develop until the age of about 25. So everything that happens to us, everything we see and hear and the people who are around us and the experiences we have shape the way that our brains develop. And so a huge factor in the way that our brains develop is who the adults are, who the people are, and in particular the adults are in our life, what they're telling us, how they're showing us, to live. And so what the adults in our lives do is tremendously important, basically.
Okay. In the stories you did, could you point out how that manifested itself and how you found out about it?
Sure. Um, one of the first stories that I did, I was interested in this idea that John Rich had put forward, and at first I was kind of skeptical. It seemed sort of like a pedantic, paternalistic notion. Father knows best, and just do what the adults do. And I wasn't really convinced by it. But the more reporting I did, the more I found it to be the case. And eventually I stumbled across a guy, a 19-year-old kid from West Oakland, who had grown up in really terrible circumstances. His father had been in jail. His mother and his aunt sort of half raised him, and I say that because they, instead of raising him, they sort of encouraged him really to adopt the life of the streets, to start committing robberies, to stealing, home invasions, and he was doing all of those things, when he was 14, 15 years old. He was in a gang by 16 or even earlier. And when he was 19, he'd already been involved in multiple violent gun encounters, shooting people, being shot, and so on. And when he was 19, he got shot in the back, and he was about to be executed by his enemy, but the enemy's bullets ran out, and so his life was spared. And when I came across him, he was recovering. He was half paralyzed, 19 years old, didn't have much life expectancy. But one of the interesting things was that he started telling me in pretty great detail about his terrible family life and the role models that he had had. His father was a criminal. His mother and his aunt were basically criminals who were encouraging him to be a criminal. And he lamented this fact. He said that this was, he recognized that this was a real problem. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me because I was hearing it, as it were, straight from the horse's mouth. And but what happened then is that over time, months and months, and now a couple of years have gone by, and I've come across that pattern so often, so repeatedly, that I really think that it's something that we're not paying enough attention to.
Tell me, how did you get the young man to speak to you about that and share what he'd gone through?
Well, I'd met his case worker. He was getting some help from a local agency that was tasked with helping young people in trouble get back on their feet, get jobs, and figure out what they were going to do. So I met the caseworker and agreed that we would, use an anonymous name. And so he put me in touch with him, and we started meeting, and he just started telling me his story. It wasn't easy at first, but I persevered, and he came around.
What was the hard part about it? Because I do think that you're going to a situation where there's so many things differentiating you from your subject. I mean, you're not an African American. You don't live in that community. You're not involved with the violence itself. And here's a young man who's all of that, and yet he starts to speak to you. And you said it took some time. How much time, and what do you think made it possible for you to get him to open up?
Well, yeah, I mean, there were some initial challenges, as you say. I'm basically coming up on middle age here, white guy. I don't have the same experiences that this young man had. So that was sort of the initial superficial hurdle. I think after that, it was a question of, he wanted to know, well, what was I going to do with this, and was I going to, publish it, and how was I going to publish it? I benefited a little bit from the fact that he was very interested in journalism, so he sort of understood the idea of telling stories, and I think he harbored a quiet ambition to become a journalist himself. And also, and this is something we can talk about more, but a lot of times he was a very traumatized young man, and a lot of times with traumatized people, there may be an initial reluctance, but once they start talking, it's almost like the floodgates just open because you're there, you're listening, you're a willing ear, a participant in their experience, you're sympathetic, and I think, I think he actually welcomed the opportunity to talk to somebody about all of these horrible things that, to get back to our original point, the adults in his life weren't doing. That was their job, and they weren't doing it. And so, there's a very prominent researcher, um, who says that, even if you have one kid and you can attach that kid to a caring adult, that kid then can kind of become a magnet around which other kids can tend to congregate because he's sort of an island of stability. And that's also a fascinating idea.
I like the point that you brought up that I took away in this discussion so far is that you actually established some connection with the young man. I mean, the idea of knowing that he might be interested in journalism, the fact that he wanted to talk about what's going on, and that there are going to be some obvious journalists who are going to be thinking, how close do I get? I mean, I'm supposed to be, in a situation where I have to be careful. Um, how did you sort of thread that needle?
Well, yeah, it's always a bit of a balancing act to know. I mean, if you're asking about safety, for instance, you have to, your personal safety is paramount here. You've got to look after yourself. In this particular case, I felt very safe because this young man had removed himself from Oakland to a city about an hour away for his safety. And so I went to visit him at his new location. He was there with his girlfriend and his baby, and they had a nice apartment. So it felt it felt safe. Of course, there are times when I've reported from here or a number of other countries where it's very, very dangerous, and in those instances, it's good to have some training before. I don't recommend that people just sort of blithely walk into dangerous neighborhoods without a sense of a little bit of a plan, knowing what they're doing. That's another discussion.
Yeah. So I hear you saying that really you want to be thoughtful about what you're doing. You may want to find a guide who, as you did, the caseworker who kind of introduces you. You find other circumstances that can help mitigate
Yeah.
the challenges that are inherent in these kinds of situations so that you can do the kind of reporting you need to. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. It always helps to establish good contacts with outreach workers, people in positions where they're coming into frequent and sustained contact with people, who you want to be in touch with. And I've done that here in Oakland with a number of different organizations. Reaching out to them, going with them into the street, meeting people that they meet. Again, my issue here is I can't just walk into, let's say, a neighborhood where where there's a heavy Norteño presence, and without at least some kind of connection. And so it's important to build up those connections, to get to know people, and to approach them with a non-judgmental, open attitude, because ultimately you're there to understand. You've got to understand what you're writing about, and the only way to understand is to listen, but an open mind.
All right. So what we really know from this first point at least is that there are circumstances that play a role in how people are going to be reacting and how their lives evolve. And in this case, when they're in precarious circumstances, this lack of a caring adult is one factor. And this is part of the way that you and your journalism are trying to find the various things that play a role in that, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just last week I met with a pastor at a church here in Oakland, and he reiterated the same point to me about fathers, lack of fathers, and you'll be able to read about it. I'm going to post it on oaklandeffect.com, so I encourage you to check it out, where you can also find all of the other stories that I've written.
So when people are going to be going to the website,
What we plan to do is put up a number of links to organizations and websites where you'll be able to read about trauma, what people are working on. You can find links to articles and research detailing some of this stuff, and hopefully you'll be able to use it as resources in your own reporting. Also, feel free to go through all the articles on the Oakland Effect website, and you'll be able to start to piece together some ideas about how this might relate to your own community.
And Scott, remind me how this particular project came about.
Well, this project came about. I was the California Endowment funded a series of projects throughout California, looking at healthcare issues, different aspects of healthcare. In some cases they're looking at elderly people. In some cases they're looking at gangs, and in this case they're looking at how violence affects the mental health of communities in the Bay Area, and in particular Oakland. Mm-hmm. So I was brought on to explore some of those issues.
And what interested you in this particular topic? What was it that drew you to it, and you thought you were going to be able to get out of it?
Well, I was a foreign correspondent for about 12 years, so I'd reported on a lot of violence and trauma in other countries, in a lot of war zones, and but I'd never done it in this country, so I was curious to see whether what I had seen in other countries was also applicable here.
All right. Let's go to the second key theme about toxic neighborhoods that become toxic and traumatic for the people living in them. What are you trying to impart there to journalists who are trying to figure out these particular types of coverage?
Well, I think the main takeaway with this particular point is that when people are traumatized, and again, this is not something that's unique to Oakland, but we see it in American cities across the country, and we also see it around the world. But when people are traumatized, their communities and their neighborhoods suffer as a result. And there are some very concrete ways that this happens. But it's essentially when people get traumatized, they accumulate a number of triggers. And these can be anything from sounds to sights to smells to other people. When people get triggered, their emotional states kind of go haywire. And scientists refer to this as dysregulation or unregulated states. And when people are dysregulated, they act out, they can either they have faulty perceptions of danger, so they may perceive danger, they may perceive too much danger, they may not perceive any danger at all when there is in fact something to be really afraid of. Basically, their perceptive systems get all out of whack. If you go to the Oakland Effect website and click on the Science of Trauma tab at the top, and go down, there is a story that I did a while ago called "Children Affected by Violence Suffer Mental Injuries." Now, in the course of reporting on this story, I found a story about a man who had been gunned down in Oakland while his small child watched. And so I was curious, what happens to these kids when they're in their neighborhood, a neighborhood that they're familiar with, they walk around, they go to church there, they live there. What happens to them if something horrific like this happens in their neighborhood. So I spoke to a lot of scientists about this, and they explained the dynamic, and it's a scary one. What happened to this kid, for instance, is that he goes to the store with his father. He's there, he's taking it all in, as kids do. His brain is absorbing everything. He's looking at his father for cues on how to interact with the world. He's taking in the smells. There's bananas, there's oranges. He looks outside. There's an ice cream truck that goes by. There's a tinkling sound of the music. Maybe a car, a muffler sound goes off. He hears the babble of voices. He's looking around. He sees the faces of the storekeeper and others. And then all of a sudden, somebody walks up and shoots his father dead right before his eyes. Now, what's going to happen to that kid? Well, he's going to start to recover. He's going to go back into his community. But over time, he will once again, when he goes to the store, see bananas, smell the oranges. He'll hear the ice cream truck. He will look at the faces. He'll see people around him. And potentially what can happen is that every time something in his environment reminds him of the traumatic event, it can, what scientists say, dysregulate his brain. He will go into a sort of state of disassociation. He could start lashing out at people. He can lose touch with his physical sense of his body. He won't know where he is in time or space. He may have trouble distinguishing danger. He may be hypervigilant, or he may be not vigilant at all. Depends on his brain. But at the end of the day, the effect is that he will be he will cease to be sort of functional in the way that you and I are right now. Sitting, we feel safe. Our bodies are normal. So imagine if you take his example and you extend it to an entire community where many people in the community have been victimized by violence, and they have all of these triggers where they'll be walking along and suddenly they'll see something that will remind them of a trauma that they experienced. So you can have a neighborhood where a lot of people in the neighborhood have been traumatized and they have a lot of triggers. So the people in the environment and the things that surround them in that environment are now, what scientists say, toxic. So the neighborhood itself becomes this very volatile, scary place in a way that it shouldn't be.
In a way, it sort of reminds you of like a war zone and the post-traumatic syndrome that we see with those who have been in the war zone, both civilians and military, when those things reoccurs, like I say, a sound or something like that. Here's another question I'm wondering about. How do we as journalists, when we go to interview people who have gone through these traumatic experiences and ask them to relive them, what kind of impact do you think we're having, and how should we approach that so that we're being in a position that we're not aggravating the situation?
Well, this is a good question. It's tricky territory. I think that the important thing to remember is that when we are going into going to talk to people, we should be compassionate. We should always approach with a non-judgmental position. And the fact is that sometimes people will talk to you and sometimes they won't, and we need to honor their boundaries. I think one of the things that I have found in reporting, both here in Oakland and also from various war zones around the world, is that reporters are in the unique position of often being the first people on the scene, the first people to sort of encounter or talk to communities that have been through a traumatic experience. So, sometimes maybe they won't talk to you, but sometimes what will happen is that the floodgates will open. And suddenly you'll find yourself on the receiving end of a huge amount of information and stories, and they'll just tell you and talk to you and tell you, and it could be therapeutic for them. The other thing to keep in mind is that I think it's important to always be forthright and frank in your dealings with people. Tell them who you are, what your objective is with this story, and honest about what you're doing. You might say something like, "Well, look, I really want to tell your story in detail because I think it will ultimately help to help the community and help policymakers to understand what people in this community are dealing with."
Good. Let's go to the theme, the third theme that we've got regarding trauma and it adversely affects the brain. You've talked some about that, but I know there's more to it than what you've shared so far, and how the healing can help in that regard.
Yeah, there is. If you go once again to the Oakland Effect website, you'll find a series of stories. One of the ones that sort of documents some of these changes is called "Scientists Seek to Treat Chronically Traumatized Brains." Now, there are many ways that trauma can affect the brain, but I'll just run through a few to give you a sense of some of the fascinating things that they're discovering.
Great.
So, some studies have found that when people are traumatized in their brains, there's something called white matter. You've all heard of gray matter. There's also white matter. Well, in traumatized people, the amount of white matter appears to be pretty significantly diminished. This is important because white matter is the connective tissue to gray matter. Gray matter produces neurons. So what they're finding is that this means that there are fewer neurons making fewer connections, and when your brain makes connections, that's what leads to intelligence and the growth of intelligence. So what we're finding is that trauma can actually physically change the brain. It can physically change the neural networks in the brain, and it can lead to cognitive impairment. It can lead to serious deficiencies in learning ability and various other pretty intense cognitive impairments. Another thing that we found is so when you're traumatized, when you're fearful, when you go into a fight or flight mode, your brain releases a chemical called cortisol. Now, cortisol is good for you in very short doses because it enables your brain to make the right decisions about whether to flee or to fight or what to do. But in overly large amounts, it can be very bad for you, cortisol. So what they found is that when people are victims of trauma in a constant chronic way, which is what we do see in a place like Oakland, where it's not just one incident that we're talking about, but trauma over weeks, months, trauma that often drags into years because people are seeing things over and over and over again, the levels of cortisol in the brain go up and they stay up. And that's not a good thing for the brain. So that's another, sort of interesting thing that we see. The bottom line, and I hear this, again and again from researchers, is that trauma changes your brain, physically changes your brain. So the trick then is what to do. And we can talk about that now, or we can get to it later. I'm happy to do it now if you'd like.
We can do that. And I also want to have you address the fact that you've been focusing on particular communities, obviously, and so we're highlighting African American community in East Oakland. You're also doing Latino community, but I sense that there are factors here that really are pertinent to any community, and that in order for us to be thinking about how we approach this coverage, that we ought to be aware of that. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a very important point, and I'm glad that you raised it. So when we think about trauma and how to cover it, and how to think about it, and sort of conceptualize, where does it exist, and who is affected by it, let's remember that it is trauma that we're talking about. We're not talking about targeting specific ethnic groups or anything like that. And I've reported, as I said, from South Africa and Pakistan and Iraq and Uganda and Mexico and so on. And in a lot of these places, wherever there is conflict, wherever there are serious societal injustices, issues, war, whatever, there are going to be people who are traumatized, including in this country. So in this country, it just so happens that the Latinos and African Americans, statistically, it's a fact, are about 16 times more likely in a certain age group, 18 to 25 males, to be killed by gun violence than Caucasians. That's a fact. So we need to look at those communities and examine how trauma is affecting them. If you go to South Africa, where I was recently, or Uganda, obviously it's a totally different situation. But the common denominator, of course, is that people are being traumatized. So one of the things that has happened is that this has led to sort of a revolution in how therapists, health practitioners are thinking about trauma. It's called trauma-informed care. And the basic idea is that instead of sort of asking this question of, what's wrong with you, and kind of pointing your finger at the victims in communities and saying, why did you do that? What's wrong with you? It is to change the question and to ask, what happened to you? And by doing that, it sort of does two things. It helps to destigmatize the communities that you're trying to help, but it also brings the attention back to the question of what happened to you, and it brings it back to the trauma, which then allows you to sort of delve into the history, whether something happened a year ago, a month ago, 5 years ago, or 25 years ago. Very often people will manifest some sort of PTSD years and years. I think the average is like 6 years after the event itself. So that's very important to remember, and it allows therapists and health practitioners to really bring more of sort of a compassionate eye to people who, in the past at least, have often been targeted for, sort of almost stigmatized for being victims, which is the wrong way to go about it.
Well, that really is, I think, so valuable, and I wanted the people in our audience to know that we're going to have some resources for you with regards to links that you can go to get some of the to places and sources that Scott has been talking about, so that you can use those as part of the things that you might be able to use in your reporting and what you might do. We're going to move now to the three key tips that Scott has sort of identified for you as a journalist that you can use. And the first tip is going to be something that I think he's sort of been talking about. Scott, you've sort of mentioned this idea of connective tissue, that you're not just looking at something on the surface, but you're looking for something more than that. Tell us more.
Yeah, I think it's just important, when reporting, as I said, I think is about, it's about people. And so we want to tell the stories of people, but we don't want to do it in a void. We don't want to just simply go in and sort of re-stigmatize people by telling their stories in a way that that separates them from the larger picture. And what I mean by that is, I think, in particular when it comes to trauma, violence, PTSD, mental health, there are a lot of really fascinating developments taking place right now in the world of science, neuroscience, psychology, and so on, that are shedding new light on how we think about the brain, the body, and people who are traumatized. This goes back to the trauma-informed care. So I think when I say connective tissue, I think it's important to tie these two things together. Look at the big picture and see what's happening. Find the people in your communities that exemplify these trends or somehow shed light on what these scientists are telling us. and try to make a connection there. Maybe you'll find it, maybe you won't, maybe it'll take some time, but make an attempt to do that, because I think people will respond well, to stories where they feel like there's a larger picture, a bigger picture than just a person, or some science.
Yeah, I think that's just such an important point that you're making, that, we don't look at things just on the surface or as isolated incidents, but more as, that this is a complicated situation. There's complexity involved in the way that people live their lives and are affected by what's going on. So I think this connective tissue, and I like that term, really makes it clear that we are really sort of an extension of our own bodies, and that society has its own body that's taking care of itself or not taking care of itself, and we need to understand how that body works. Let's go to the second tip that you have that you've mentioned regarding the fact that you've said to the abandoned preconceptions and stereotypes. How did you go about doing that with regards to doing these stories?
Well, again, this was I think this is important, and it was hard for it was not. I mean, yeah, it was challenging. I think I've had people, in my area of interest, sort of cast doubt on my ability as a white man to understand their plight and their situation, and I think it's important to just persevere, and appeal to the better angels in everyone, including ourselves. And part of that is to really let go of preconceptions and stereotypes. I have found in the course of a 14-year reporting career that I had a lot of them. And it's not easy to do, but it's important to make a continual effort to let go of these things, because the more you do, the more you can be surprised as a reporter, as a storyteller, and as a human being about what other people are capable of, good and bad, I should say. It's not about always telling some great story. It's about being able to be surprised. I mean, people are people. I mean, learn their names, learn their stories, learn everything that you can about them. You can never know too much about people. In fact, I was giving a talk the other day, and somebody said, "Well, but what if I get too close to my subjects, and what if I don't want to know what they tell me?" And my theory is that you can't know too much about people. The more you know, the more human people become. That's our problem, right? Is that we tend to dehumanize people. I mean, let's learn as much as we possibly can about each other. It'll allow us to tell each other stories in a much better, more compassionate way, and a more truthful way. And I think that hat of being truthful, the reporter's hat, is one that I always try to keep front and center.
Great. Let's go to the third point that we want to make, which has to do with how you can make that happen, which is spend time, you've said, talking to people in your neighborhoods. How did you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's fun. It's the funnest part of the job. You just go out and eat in your eat in your beat. Just talk to people. Stop people on the street. Get into conversations. Talk to cops. Talk to homeless people. Talk to the woman who works at the Burger King and takes out the trash. Talk to the guy who sells guns and is super racist. Find out what he says and what he knows. I mean, the more you become sort of familiar and comfortable in the places that you're reporting on, I think, again, it goes to this issue of the better able you'll be to tell these stories. I think when you're talking about people and the terrible tragedies that they have endured or inflicted upon others, it's impossible to do over the phone. Science you can do over the phone, but not people's stories. You need to get out there and get your hands dirty.
Great. Well, why don't we go to the questions now that you may have, and we have a chat box that you'll see, and we will share these with Scott so he can give you some feedback. So if you're interested, please do that. And our producer, one of our producers, Elizabeth Pinu, is bringing that up for us. So from Mike Holland, the question is, how do you report on the violence without forming a personal connection?
Well, I suppose, yeah, it's a good question. How do you report on the violence, or how do you report on anything without forming a personal connection? Sometimes you do form personal connections. I don't think that's a bad thing. You can form personal connections and still do your job. I think, to a certain extent, the myth of journalism is impartiality and total non, no bias, totally objective. Well, I don't buy that. I mean, we are humans. We are flawed. We are biased by nature. That's my personal take on it. We're subjective. It doesn't mean that we also can't be intelligent, critical thinkers who can sort of bring our rational minds to bear on emotional issues. These are emotional issues. Let there be no mistake about it. They're incredibly emotional. But we have to strike that balance of being human. Well, it's a razor's edge. You've got to be human. You've got to be a human being, but you've also got to tell the truth. And I think telling the truth is often that thing that kind of pulls you back. It keeps you from exaggerating, from doing something that the sympathy with your subject might compel you to do in another circumstance.
Yeah, I like that point, and I want to support that this myth of objectivity, that we can't be close, and also to help us realize that we're telling stories here, and these stories are not the whole story. They're the stories that I think, Scott, you've either witnessed or you've recreated from the witnesses who've been there, and that we have to make some connection to that experience in order to give it some sense of authenticity. And the more distant you are, the less, I think, closer you are to the quote, truth, unquote, of what is going on. And it's one truth, one version, one idea, and we need to recognize that. And it's the amalgamation of many of those truths that help us see a bigger picture.
Yeah, sure.
One of the other things that Mike was asking about is, how do you get people to open up to you?
Well, that's a good question. I think that's where the art of journalism kind of comes in. How do you do it? Jokes. Everyone has their own way of doing it. Every journalist is different. I have my ways. I don't even know if I'm aware of all of them. I think it's sort of a bag of tricks that you just sort of pick up over time. A lot of it is so integrally tied to your personality and what you can bring to any social interaction, whether it's with your friends or your parents. How do you make your friends laugh? How do you get your mom to do something that she might not otherwise want to do? I mean, there's a little bit of manipulation sometimes, sure. I mean, let's be honest. You play to your strengths. What are you good at? Are you a good listener? Are you a good storyteller? Are you good? I mean, are you comfortable with sort of hamming it up, or do you like to play games? I don't know. I mean, whatever your strengths are, play to those. That's what I always tell people.
I think that's a really good point, and I want to add to that going back to Scott's third point about spending time. One of the things that I think we fail often as journalists is in the view that we can just come up to people and ask them questions and they'll talk to us. Now, some will, and they're ready to talk right at that moment. But the value of spending time, getting to know the people, will put you in a position to be there when they are willing to talk. And you might be able to get information that you wouldn't have otherwise. The fact is, when you go into communities that have never seen you before and you start asking personal questions, important questions, they're going to be reluctant to speak to you unless you have certain attributes that you might be able to use to draw them out. But in the long run, they're going to be very suspicious about why you're there when you haven't been there before and what you're going to do when you leave. So be of a mindset that says, I'm going to get to know these people, so then I can ask the right question. Because it's not just the questions that are important. It's asking the question that I think Scott has done by spending time in those communities that will elicit the kind of understanding you need. Does that make sense, Scott?
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Okay, now Donna has said that there are folks that have the NIMBY approach, not in my neighborhood regarding crime. So how do you use these stories to engage readers and foster interest and participation?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's one of the big challenges that I have had because in any city, and including Oakland, you have very nice neighborhoods, and you also have kind of not that great neighborhoods. So there will be people who say, I'm just not interested. This isn't my world. This isn't my. These aren't my people. Why should I care? Essentially. And I've done a couple of stories and tried to address this. One of the more interesting ones that I found is looking at crime statistics and how crime, in particular homicides and so on, can affect a city's economy. And it's a little maybe perhaps cynical, but it's very interesting because if you look, there are studies, there are a couple of researchers, one in Chicago and one in North Carolina, who've done some really interesting studies on the costs of crime, and they've found that murders basically end up costing taxpayers a huge amount of money. And these are taxpayers from across the city. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but the bottom line is that you've got, the murders that are happening 10 miles away on the other part of the city do affect you if you are living in an area where there aren't that many murders, because you're helping to pay for the consequences of those murders. When murders occur in a city, other researchers have also found that about 70 people tend to leave a city every time a murder takes place. Now, I mean, again, it's more complicated than that, but that is a known phenomenon. And so what happens to a city's economic viability, what happens to its vibrancy, its ability to attract investment, foreign and domestic, when people are fleeing the city? This is something that concerns everybody. So, those kinds of stories, I think, can elicit interest and so on from people. They're a little bit, as I said, perhaps cynical, but we can also always appeal to just the human decency of caring about our fellow citizens. You never know who you're going to cross or who you will need down the road. I mean, we should care about each other.
I think, that's really important that, we're not doing this just for, people who don't care and for just to put it in the air. So it's important to be in a position that we have some sort of understanding of what's going on. We got another question from Lindsay. She says, Scott, when you were in Iraq and Afghanistan, were you able to report on the pain of individual families as you do now in Oakland? And if so, what did you learn abroad that you can apply to what you've done in the USA? Do you think these stories are more similar than different?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, answer to the first part of the question is yes, I was able to report on the pain of individual families in lots of different ways. In Iraq, for instance, I would report on people who had died in or families of people who died in suicide bombings. I had a translator actually in Iraq whose son was kidnapped and killed. He himself was captured and tortured in the attempt to rescue his son, which he was not able to do. And So yes, I've done that, and you know, I think again, how does this apply to what we what we're doing here in Oakland? I think you know probably more than anything, it just sort of taught me that the human experience of pain and trauma and the human experience of violence is just it's the same. No matter if you're in Iraq or Oakland, when you lose a family member, uh, it is just grief. How you cope with it is going to be the same. I mean, sure, there will be some cultural differences and so on, but this is a very human experience that we're talking about. And I feel actually very fortunate to have had the chance to see what it looks like in so many different parts of the world, because it's almost reassuring and comforting to feel like there is a bigger picture here.
Let me bring this even a little more personal to you, Scott. I mean, here you are having reported in different places where there's been a lot of violence, and you're doing it here in this community where, obviously there's violence, and that has to have some impact on you. And how do you deal with that? And I think you and I have had other conversations about the healing process that has certain techniques that can help people kind of, you know, take advantage of this technique to help them kind of recalibrate themselves. Could you tell me more about that?
Sure. Um, yeah, there are a number of healing mechanisms that people are looking at now. These are things that are being applied in the therapeutic community that deals specifically with high impact neighborhoods, like the kind that we've been talking about, but also with journalists who cover this sort of stuff. There's an increasing awareness that journalists who report on war zones and conflict zones and homicides even in this country do often become traumatized by what they call residual trauma or witness trauma. So there are resources available. Therapists are also looking at things like mindfulness, breathing, meditation, therapy called EMDR, which is eye movement rapid desensitization, as a very effective tool for trauma. It's been around for about a decade, but it's very effective. Works on sort of bilateral hemisphere stuff in the brain, biofeedback. There's really an awareness that there is a problem, and that trauma changes the brain, but that there are these tools that can help to reverse it at a cellular and molecular level, and also at a psychological and emotional level.
So even just taking a deep breath,
yes,
can be effective, right?
Very effective. Sometimes it's more effective than anything else.
Okay. Yeah. One more question we've got here from Jennifer. She says, how do you approach victims of trauma for follow-up stories once you have left the crime scene without making them feel exploited or that you're stepping over your boundary?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's harder actually for a beat reporter, like let's say you're a police reporter and you have to cover every crime that happens and you're constantly moving from one to the next and so on. It's hard. How do you keep track of all these people, and how do you let them know? I mean, you can give them a call back, follow up with them, see how they're doing. You never know. It's sort of a two-pronged thing. I mean, you're doing it maybe as a human being to just reach out, but also maybe they'll come at you with another story or something that you didn't think about. If you have the luxury, as I do, to sort of spend more time on projects and really get to know people, I think you run into that problem a little bit less because you're showing them over the course of several weeks that you're actually invested in their lives and in their stories, and they'll probably come back to you once the story is done anyway.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Scott. We really appreciate you taking the time. I think the stories you're doing are really valuable in helping us understand the connections that are taking place, that's behind the violence and how it affects people and how that plays a role in our society at large. And I hope that all of you out there, journalists who are thinking about doing similar coverage, will take advantage of this particular webinar to use that to inform you, to use the tips that Scott has given you, and to realize that these are opportunities for you to help really understand the connective tissues that are out there. I want to thank our producers, Evelyn Sue and Elizabeth Pino, who have been helping us in producing this, and the Poynter Institute, California Endowment for that has provided money, and the Oakland Tribune. Thanks again to all of you for being part of this webinar. We really appreciate it and hope you benefited.